Barely a week goes by when the great energy transition isn't making some sort of news. This week, the government announced feasibility licences to progress Australia's first offshore wind zone in waters off Gippsland in Victoria. At the same time, Energy Minister Chris Bowen is talking up the need to find more gas supplies. The government's also been making all sorts of announcements under its new Future Made in Australia policy to subsidise things like the local manufacturing of solar panels. The coalition, meanwhile, it continues to talk up its plans for nuclear power in Australia, even if we don't know when those plans will actually be announced. This week we also saw a concerning report from the Grattan Institute, which warned that the great energy transition is not going well in its view. So, are we on the right track? And how bumpy is this track likely to be? I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Now, there are few better experts on Australia's energy market than Kerry Schott, the former chair of the Energy Security Board. And a few years back, she was tasked with redesigning the national electricity market to accommodate the influx of renewables. These days, Dr Schott is the chair of the Carbon Market Institute and sits on the board of AGL, amongst other things. Kerry Schott, welcome. Really good to talk to you.
Thanks, David.
So, look, there are concerns, and we saw it in the Grattan Institute report this week about the energy transition. It found in this report that it's ad hoc, that it's uncoordinated, not going well. What do you reckon? How would you see this transition going at this point?
It's certainly very rocky at the moment. I think it's going in the right direction, but there's no doubt that we're behind with the transmission build. And the other areas of difficulty are the connections that the wind and solar generators are having in getting onto the grid in time. So there's nobody ever thought it was going to be terribly smooth, but it's certainly not smooth at the moment.
And just to drill down on what you said there, what's holding that up, those connections?
Oh, look, it's just difficult for AEMO to move from the sort of system that they had, which had large-scale coal connecting in a few places, to something now that's got literally hundreds and hundreds of new connections all over the grid. And maintaining the stability of that grid becomes a much more difficult task. It needs much more sophisticated algorithms. And frankly, this transition is so big that everybody is learning as we're going.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the case. And look, the government has, and it talked about this before coming to power, pumping a lot of money into transmission. Is that enough at the moment? How do we overcome these transmission problems?
Look, at the moment, the problem with transmission, I don't think is the money. I think it's actually the difficulties about skilled labour shortages, particularly in regional areas. And it's also been slowed down by what's called social licence issues, but effectively a local community is not too keen on having giant towers, or indeed windmills come to that, put across their landscape.
So ultimately, will government have to put its foot down and just override those community concerns, do you think? I mean, how is this resolved?
Look, it's been resolved. It just takes time to resolve. And it gets resolved by ensuring that regional areas actually get positive benefits out of this, not just temporarily, but longer term.
Well, look, in the meantime, there is some calls for the life of coal-fired power to be extended because of the rockiness, as you put it, of the transition at the moment. Tony Wood from the Grattan Institute, he thinks coal-fired power at the moment is due to be phased out by 2030. I think that's a little earlier than some of the scheduled closures. Therefore, there is an argument that state governments need to start talking to the generators about extending their life. What do you think on this one? Should state governments be funding the extension of some coal plants?
Look, personally, I find that rather appalling. But it may become necessary for short periods of time. But what's actually missing in this equation is what's called firm power, which means that it's running all the time and you're not reliant on the weather. So what we need is more batteries and more hydro and, dare I say, more gas. And we don't need it for very long, but when we do need it, we definitely need it.
Yeah, and I'll come to gas, but just on this question of extending coal, New South Wales is talking to the Eraring, to Origin about extending Eraring. Is that something that's inevitable? I mean, I think you used the word appalling there, which is a pretty strong word, but is it inevitable?
No, I don't think so. The previous government looked at the extension of Eraring and realised at the time that what was missing was security in the grid, so things that provide frequency and inertia. And to address that, they decided to put in a very large battery in the Hunter, and that has happened. And whether or not Eraring is needed for capacity, i.e. megawatts, or whether it's needed for security is not altogether clear at the moment. I'm not sure what has changed. And AEMO have certainly flagged that there's a need for capacity in New South Wales, but possibly not in the next 12 months, maybe a year after that.
So you're not convinced the New South Wales government needs to do this?
Well, the problem is that if Eraring is closed down, you can't start coal-fired power up again. If it's closed, it's closed. So it depends when the shortage is going to appear. And AEMO made clear that while they can see that there may be a shortage, they also said that there wouldn't be if everybody did what they said they were going to do and projects that were underway were actually completed on time. So we're in a bit of a never land with this at the moment.
Are those projects being completed, the batteries and other projects that are going to be needed?
They are, but again, the state government and nobody would want to be relying on projects being completed for the reliability of the system. So it will come down to whether or not people feel comfortable, and in fact whether governments feel comfortable with the reliability that's there.
If it was your decision, what would you be doing?
I'd be quite cautious about it. Nobody wants unreliability in the power system.
They certainly don't. And gas, I guess, comes in here. And you mentioned that. Chris Bowen, the minister, has been talking this week about the need for more gas. Is he right? Do we need to tap more supply?
Look, for the electricity industry, the amount of gas that's needed is not large. What gas is needed for is for heat in industrial processes, like making steel and things of that nature. And a lot of big industry use gas for intense heat. And it's for industrial purposes that we're short on gas largely. But remember, New South Wales and Victoria in particular use gas in their homes for heating. So there's a big retail demand for gas as well that's not going to go down until new houses are built that don't have gas attached to them.
Unless people can be convinced or incentivised to replace their existing gas.
I think if you don't have gas, going all electric is certainly more favourable for your bills than going gas as well.
So, I mean, the beauty of gas is that it can be turned off and on. It can support the renewables rollout. So again, and given its industrial application as well, do you think we need more supply or have we got enough?
We definitely need to make sure that we've got domestic supply that's there and secure for both industry and also for electricity. But just to put the demand for electricity into context, once we're up to a very high percentage of renewables, as South Australia is, for example, the gas plants will run very few times, and indeed it comes down to weeks of the year and not all in one chunk. So the amount of emissions that would be put into the atmosphere is far, far less than it is when you have to burn coal all the time.
Which makes it this transition fuel, as its proponents suggest. So just to be clear, is it obvious that we have enough supply or still need more?
I think we have enough supply, but domestic supply is the issue rather than export supply.
Because the producers are going to make more exporting it, right?
That's right, yes.
So this is where things like that local domestic supply mechanism that the government has at its disposal comes into play, and that might be enough to ensure that we have adequate supply here.
I think so. It's also the case that the gas suppliers have export contracts that they must meet.
Now, what about the government's Future Made in Australia plan? I'm keen for your thoughts on this, given your long experience in both private and the public sector. We've seen so far, and there'll be more in the budget, no doubt, but announcements on subsidising local solar making manufacturing. They're talking about batteries, various other green technology as well. Is this a good idea?
Look, I think it has advantages if it's done properly. And it's everyone's waiting to see if the turns out to turn out the right way. What the government's talking about now, they've made clear that what they're going to fund need to meet a number of criteria which they've met, and the criteria that the Treasurer has spelled out includes basically Australia having a comparative advantage. So it would favour energy intensity production like green steel, green aluminium, green silica, green fertiliser. And the reason for that is that Australia has terrific resources in sun and wind, and a lot of those processes don't necessarily have to run all the time and can adapt, along with some batteries, to use the intensive energy that we've got, and we can then export that in products. So things of that nature we've got a comparative advantage in.
Do we have a comparative advantage, though, in making solar panels in Australia?
Look, there's been a lot of discussion about that, and the thing about solar panels is we're never going to compete with the price of Chinese panels. But we do have terrific solar panel technology in several of our universities, and indeed have led the global way on solar technology. And what Australian panels do, they are higher quality and last longer. So there may be an advantage in the type of product we're producing, not mass cheap products, but mass. Not necessarily mass, but products that are serving particular purposes.
Well, I mean, the deal that's been announced some weeks ago with SunDrive, we should point out AGL is sort of partnering here. You're on the board of AGL. I think it's the deal is here what AGL buys has a take-off agreement. It will buy the solar panels that are made there on the site of the old Liddell plant. Is that how it works, and is that a good deal for AGL?
Look, what AGL's doing is it's creating an energy hub where the Liddell power plant used to be. And what we're doing is encouraging industry of a number of kinds in there to get going. And it's part of the government's also, of course, looking at hydrogen hubs in both Newcastle and Port Kembla and elsewhere to trial the manufacture of hydrogen. So it's just part of a number of things in that energy hub.
But I mean, the concern of someone like Rod Sims, we heard last week, he's chair of the Superpower Institute these days. He worries this might slow down our transition to net zero. You'd be, buying cheaper solar panels from China might get you there faster. What would you say to that?
Oh, I think that's potentially right. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we substitute more expensive Australian-made panels for cheaper Chinese panels.
But are these ones going to be more expensive, the ones being built at Liddell?
I don't know, David. At the moment, Australian production of panels is more expensive, and I do know that they also have a longer life. So you're trading off one thing against another.
Swings and roundabouts. It might, over time, be a more effective investment.
That's right. And what AGL are interested in developing in that energy hub is actually solar panel recycling. And there's certainly a need for that and a market for it.
Yeah, I mean, where's that at? I'm not sure if this is your particular expertise, but because you do hear concerns about the enormous waste that's going to be involved here. How developed is the idea of recycling solar panels?
I don't know, David. All I know is that it's coming along, and I think the panic that was there earlier has subsided somewhat.
But getting back to what the government's investing in, what it's subsidising, what it's offering potential tax breaks for as well. Solar panels, it sounds like you think there could be an argument for the government to be doing this. What about battery making as well, or is that something we're not going to have a comparative advantage in?
Look, I don't know. It's up to the private sector to be able to demonstrate that it's got a chance of meeting the criteria that the Treasurer has set. And I think the main thing here is no economist, including me, wants to go back to a fundamental build it in Australia model, which is grossly inefficient and which we experienced during the 50s when we were subsidising textile clothing and footwear and motor cars and a whole lot of manufacturing that we were frankly miles behind the eight ball on, and it would be, of course, extraordinarily unproductive to go down that route. But if we can use the energy transition to get into some things where we've got a comparative advantage, then that's great. I think the main thing now is for the government to make sure that these decisions are made at some arm's length from politicians and that the criteria to be met is set out quite clearly so that everybody can see that transparent decisions are being made.
Is that happening, though, given the announcements we've seen so far, and there's a big one on quantum computing this week as well? Are they happening at arm's length from politicians, or would you like to see more independence and oversight of this?
Well, this is a policy that's just been announced, so it's in the wait-and-see basket.
Yeah, but we are seeing announcements made already, whether it's solar panels, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's critical minerals processing. They're already rolling out announcements. It sounds like you'd still like to see a bit more independence in the process?
I'd like to see the way that the decisions are made being made quite transparent.
And it's not at the moment?
Not all of it, I don't think. I noticed some criticism about the quantum computing decision from University of New South Wales today. So it's a matter of making sure that the decisions are absolutely transparent, and while those who miss out will always feel disappointed, that at least you know why decisions were made.
Well, it sounds then, just to finish this issue, you're giving some qualified support to what they're doing here. It just needs to be transparent about what they're doing, and it needs to be very focused on areas that Australia will have a comparative advantage in.
That's right, and there are a number of other criteria that were set too. It needs to improve the capability of the workforce, improve regional development, and and also, of course, help with the move to net zero emissions.
And just thinking about how this should be best done, rather than Cabinet deciding where to put money, should it be an independent body like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Future Fund, a body like that that's allocating these funds?
I think so. I haven't, apart from the general statement I've made about we need something, I haven't really put further thought to it.
But an independent group of experts like that might be a better approach.
Exactly. And, well, we all know that people sitting at a cabinet table are not the right people to be making these sorts of decisions.
Well, they seem to be at the moment. They do. All right. Let me ask you about nuclear power, finally, Kerry Schott. You've argued in the past that it doesn't make sense for Australia. Is it still your view, and why?
Look, it's still my view, and it's the view of the everybody in the industry, in the electricity industry, that it doesn't make sense. It would slow down the transition, and it's actually a much more expensive option. The CSIRO have done some costing of these things, and nuclear is far more expensive, and it also has the disadvantage that coal does, in that it has to run all the time. And with the energy system that we're transitioning to, what you need is something to fill in to replace the intermittency of wind and gas.
And well, look, that is a disadvantage, clearly, of both coal and nuclear. The Coalition would argue The advantage is you can plug it into the existing transmission lines on the old sites of coal-fired power stations. And we talked about the problems with transmission a little earlier. And, of course, the zero emissions. Does that help the case for nuclear at all?
Well, what that implies is that the nuclear plants are going to be in the regions where the coal mines are at the moment. And it's not clear to me that those local communities would be welcoming that development.
And what about the companies that own those sites, including AGL?
Well, AGL's made clear that in their view, they do not want it on the Liddell site, and that it would slow down the transition to net zero in electricity.
So if there's no appetite there, what about the actual legislative ban on nuclear power in Australia? Should that be lifted? Because there's an argument that, well, at least, then the private sector could have a good look at it. Companies can make their own decision if it's no longer banned in Australia. What do you think? Is it worth lifting the ban?
Look, I don't have a view on that. What I'd say, David, is that if the ban wasn't there, the decision would be the same one that I'm just arguing.
Yeah, that's probably fair enough. Look, just finally, Kerry Schott, coming back to where we started, when you look at the point we're on in this energy transition towards net zero, it is rocky, as you said. Are we likely to see higher prices and more blackouts in the years ahead? What does it look like for households in the immediate future?
Look, we certainly won't see more blackouts because everybody will make sure that doesn't happen one way or another. With prices, what you need to recognise is that wholesale prices, i.e. the price of your electricity in the wholesale market, is falling and has fallen dramatically. And just looking at prices over the last 12 months in the wholesale market, they've fallen almost 50% on a year-on-year basis. That's feeding through into bills. But the other thing that's feeding through into bills, which is sending them up, is the cost of networks, which is transmission and distribution. And both of those types of networks have to make changes to accommodate the changes going on. So
you've got one factor there pushing downward pressure on prices, but another pushing them up.
Yes.
So are we looking at a continuation of prices where they're at, or what's your best guess?
Look, it depends on how much the government decides to subsidise, if you like, or put money into the transmission and distribution systems. And with the Reconstruction Fund, there's significant billions of dollars going into transmission, and the government can use that to keep a limit on prices. And the other thing to remember about this bill that's going on, it's a bill that will last for, 80 years. These are not sort of assets that you put there and then they disappear in 10. So the write-off period is very long, and it's a expenditure that needs to be spread across many generations, if I can put it like that, not just all borne by this one.
Well, it's a complex challenge ahead of the nation, this energy transition, but fascinating to hear your thoughts on how it's all going. I really appreciate your time. Kerry Schott, thank you.
Thanks, David.
Well, thank you for listening as well, and don't forget to rate and review and send us an email, insiders@abc.net.au, with any ideas you have for this podcast. We'll see you Sunday morning. Bye for now.
Making us all feel very excited about being here.